Maybe we could start. So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all comfortably back for the next few sessions. My name is Iva Melinchak-Zlodi. I will be the moderator for the rest of the day. And I will just say a few words about housekeeping. This is probably not the first session for all of you as attendees today, so you already know that if in case you wish to ask questions after the lecture, you will have the chance during the presentation using the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. So after the lecture is finished, I will ask the questions to our keynote lecturer. And now I will try to, I will introduce our third and last keynote for today. She comes from an opposite time zone, so we should probably tell her good morning and not good afternoon as for the rest of us. I would like to say a few words about her. Her name is Lisa Janicke Hinchliffe. She comes from the University of Illinois-Urbana, Champaign. And there she is a professor as well as coordinator for information literacy services and instruction, and also affiliate professor in the School of Information Sciences. So she has a dual role, both in library and as a professor. And her responsibilities encompass instruction programs for library users, professional development for library staff and faculty, as campus outreach and collaboration related to teaching and learning. She is also very active and used to be a president for a few years in Association of College and Research Libraries. She is currently an editor in a journal, Library Trends, and probably most of us know her as a very active chef in the very influential and sometimes controversial blog Scholarly Kitchen. So she's, in every case, she's very interested in the issues of scholarly communication and publishing and the role that library can have in those areas. And after today's lectures and panels, where we mostly got the overview of what happens in the arena of open science and open access, but from the point of the view of editors, researchers, authors, now we will, through this keynote lecture, have the opportunity to hear what about libraries in this area. So how can libraries contribute to making open access and open science real? And what is their role in open publishing? So please, Lisa, the floor is yours, and please take over.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I am sorry that the current era doesn't allow us to join together in person, but it's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. I have very fond memories of my time in Croatia when I've been there. So yes, as Eva said, I will be addressing the issue of the library's role in open publishing model, and particularly the investments that libraries make in order to help foster an open publishing, open scholarship world. So as we go through, I welcome you to think of questions that you want to ask at the end, and a dialogue that we can have. Also, if you are tweeting, I have given you my Twitter handle, which is Lisa Librarian, and also my email address should you ever wish to follow up with me. So let's see here. So I find that when we start to think about the ways that libraries invest in open publishing, it's very important that we understand that libraries have always invested in the publishing ecosystem, and we did so through library subscriptions. So look, I want to give a brief historical review of the process of library subscriptions, like how did we do this, and the effect that they had in the ways that certain things came into being in our various contexts. So the first thing is, how did we actually subscribe to content in the subscription era? We actually did so in a variety of ways. Most historically, sort of that we can think of, is by individual title subscriptions. We would get those directly from the publisher, just like an individual would subscribe to a magazine that comes to their home. But we also got them via subscription agencies. Most prominent in the United States, for example, was EBSCO, which served to aggregate subscriptions in the print world so that a library would basically outsource its subscription management to EBSCO, which then had relationships with all of the publishers. When we see things coming into the digital age in the really early 2000s, late 1990s, we start to have the ability to buy packages from publishers because of the digital age. And we particularly see the onset of what we call the big deal, which is where libraries would take as a package in digital form all of the content from a particular publisher. And so, of course, the degree to which this was a big deal also was affected by the degree to which the publisher had a very large portfolio. So primarily here, we're talking about things like Springer Nature, Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and the like. We also saw the rise of subset collections where given publishers might say, well, you can buy our social sciences package or our STEM package rather than the entire package for those institutions that maybe didn't need everything. But into the digital age, we see the sort of reinvention, if you will, of the subscription agent into a content via platforms or aggregators. And you'll see that EBSCO appears here again. So EBSCO reinventing itself from a print subscription agent into a content aggregator in the digital age. Muse is another example of those. So this is how we're moving along, you know, kind of a little bit over time, but essentially this is paying for reading. And as a result of paying for reading, libraries had a quality control effect on what was published, because essentially if you couldn't convince libraries to buy it, you didn't have a revenue stream. And so libraries sought out quality content for their collections, and that had a weeding out effect on what might be not as high of quality. And by and large, libraries did not buy vanity publications, as we would call them, or self-published items. So, come early 2000, we have this statement from the Budapest Open Access Initiative. And I'm sure many people have seen this statement before, but it's so formative that I think it's really important that we understand what it says in order to understand how libraries are approaching paying for publishing as opposed to paying for reading. In particular, you will see there's this positing in 2002 that there's a massive crash happening. We have the scholarly publishing tradition and we have the internet. And the idea here is that there's a public good made possible in this world of the internet because peer-reviewed journal articles could be made free and distributed to everyone in the world if we changed up our notion of paying to read into some other business model. Now, interestingly enough, I just want to point out for those of you not in libraries, this 2002 Budapest Open Access Initiative coincides with the rise of paying for the big deal as a subscription model. And so we have two things happening. We have libraries buying full packages of everything, and we also have this emerging notion that information, that scholarly articles should be available without charge to readers. The Budapest Open Access Initiative also gives us the definition in descriptive terms of what is meant by open access. And I will just point out that it is much more than free reading. It is all of the things in this bolded paragraph, this bold sentence. Read, yes, but download, copy, distribute, print, search, etc. At the time when this statement was written, there were no Creative Commons licenses. So you won't see a mention of CC BY, for example, in this statement. But as those licenses came on the scene, it was seen that closest aligned, not perfect, but closest to this definition is the CC BY license. So CC BY is the closest we get to the license that matches this narrative statement in the Budapest Open Access Initiative. Now, why that's important is because we now see in a lot of policy documents the insistence on CC BY, and not everyone understands where that came from. Why is that the insisted license? Well, it traces its roots back to the Budapest Open Access Initiative. I'd also like to point out that it says here that there should be no barriers greater than getting access to the internet. But first of all, we know that getting access to the internet is not a globally equitable situation. We have parts of the world that absolutely do not have good access to the internet or access at all. We also know that there's policy regimes that prevent access to certain information. Even if you have access to the internet, you might have legal barriers due to governmental policies and the like relative to censorship of particular content. And then, of course, financial barriers are significant in the sense that internet access can be very expensive, but you also need devices in order to access information that's posted online. And then something not mentioned here at all is whether or not there's any right to education or provision that you should be able to expect that this information is presented in a way that's understandable to the common person. So this is still the scholarly literature, so it may not be intellectually or cognitively accessible to non-experts. So I just think it's important that we understand this particular statement. And then finally, I want to point out that this statement pointed out as well, so free to read doesn't mean it doesn't cost money to make it. And so it does allow and say that it should be accessible without cost to readers, but it's not costless to produce. Now, and they also go on to say that we're going to need new cost recovery models and financial mechanisms. Now, they were particularly hopeful in this statement that it would cost less in an open access world to distribute content than it costs to subscribe to content in a subscription world. This has turned out not to be the case for a variety of reasons, and people even who signed this 2002 initiative statement have said that they didn't fully understand some of the economic and financial models that were happening around this work. So needless to say, it's actually quite a costly endeavor in many cases. But building on this sort of manifesto, if you will, has been a whole, 2 decades worth of mandates, policies, and attempts to invest in open access infrastructures in order to enable the vision that was laid out in the Budapest Open Access Initiative. So we have mandates such as Harvard and the University of Illinois that say to their faculties that they must publish open access. We have governmental mandates such as the US Federal Public Access Policy, the UK REF statement, and we have funder policies like the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation, and Plan S, all of which sort of put a policy regime in place that says we are going to do open access. But that, in most cases, did not fully address, of course, the how are we going to pay for it? And so, building on these policies, building out from this, recognizing that there needs to be a way to fund these business models, there have been a lot of different efforts. And so I want to be clear that libraries have not been the only players in funding the open access transition, but they are seen as a very important funder or funding stream. And I want to talk for the rest of the time today about how libraries are doing this kind of funding. Because it's not that we can just like cancel our subscriptions today, because we still have that closed access content that our scholars need access to. So we'll talk through all of these. But before I do that, I want to also just unpack a little bit more about the open access impact on the role of the library. And so we see that historically, the way, I mean, this is a very broad strokes, right? User access to content worked this way. The author published something, the library purchased access, then the user discovered it, and then the library delivered it. Unfortunately, however, that gets a little disrupted by open access. And so I shouldn't say unfortunately, just in reality, it gets disrupted by open access. And so we need to think through, what does this new model look like? So on the right-hand side, I've attempted to sort of model out what I think is the way we can sort of think as a very high level of what is happening, which is that there's a payment to the publisher, then the author publishes, the user discovers, and then the user accesses. And so we can see that we've got the inversion of the top level from author publishes, library purchases, to somebody pays the publisher and then the author can publish. So what that has meant is that we've got emerging library roles across scholarly communications. In the payment to the publisher, we've got a variety of approaches that libraries have taken in order to enable that payment and that support. We also have things that are happening around the issue of authors publishing, where libraries have increased immensely their copyright education, their understanding of funder compliance mandates, and the provision of institutional repositories through libraries. On the discovery side, we've seen in the past decade in particular, maybe even the past 5 years, a massive effort to integrate open access content into library-supported discovery tools so that the user can discover it. In other words, where discovery can be delivery, because the content itself is openly available. And so there's no need for any further fulfillment role from the library, because once you've discovered it, you have access to it. So what I'm going to do today is really call our attention to this upper part, which is, how does the publisher get paid to produce the scholarship if it's not paid, the publisher doesn't have the lagging payment of subscriptions? Which brings us to the impact of the library on open access publishing. The first kind of contract I want to talk about with respect to the way libraries are paying for publishing is what I have termed the new big deal, the transformative agreement. A transformative agreement is where a library subscribes to the entire content of a publisher's output, but does so in order to enable publishing by their researchers across that portfolio. And so the idea here is that we shift our funds from paying to read to paying to publish, but with the existing publishers where we were paying to read. The leading groups in this area are affiliated with OA2020, which comes out of the Max Planck Institute and sort of grew out globally from there. And so we even have like the ESAC registry of these kinds of transformative agreements, where you can go and look at which countries and which consortia are striking contracts with which transformative publishers. The earliest ones listed on that site are from 2016, and I believe it's Elsevier and Wiley that were the first to have these kinds of transformative agreements available. We hear transformative agreements often described as read and publish or publish and read. So another set of language here. In a read and publish agreement, the spend stays with both reading and publishing, where in other words, the math is that there's a little bit of payment on both sides of things, reading for those things that are still closed, publishing in order to enable publishing. The publishing side of it can be unlimited, or it can be a metered kind of access in the same way. On publish and read contracts, all of the payment is for publishing, and reading is thrown in for free. Now, we might think, how does that really matter? and I won't have time to go into it today, but in general, libraries will probably want to stay more with the read and publish, with the way that our consortia work, and publishers are likely to be wanting to push the payment to the publishing side, particularly if they are trying to foster growth in open access publishing. That's a broad statement. There's a lot more to say about that. So read and publish, I forgot I had a slide here, sorry. So what I just said, read and publish agreement versus publish and read. There's another kind of contract out there, which we have to think is an additional kind of contract libraries are now paying for. So they're not taking their existing subscription spend, but instead they are striking what I have termed the pure publish agreement, an agreement with a publisher that never existed under the subscription access world. Examples are things like PLOS, MDPI, Frontiers. These are not publishers where libraries ever had subscriptions, and so we can't repurpose our spend. We have to come up with new spend. So this is a pure publish agreement, is one where it is only payment for publishing. There is no payment for reading. There is no toll reading that is even possible because the content is fully open. And so we're seeing an emergence of these, particularly with larger institutions that have very large publishing portfolios. And then again, mostly with those larger pure publishers, because it has to be worth it for a library to go in, if you will, and start spending. To do this kind of contract, you want to have a certain level of spend. Otherwise, you're better off just paying one-off APCs on behalf of authors. So those are cases where the payment is for open access and they flip. There's no subscriptions. The goal here is to get out of the subscription mode and into paying for publishing. There's a more recent thing that has emerged called subscribe to open, which I'd like to remind people is a subscription model for funding open access. So it does not ever move us away from subscriptions. The payment is still for reading, not for publishing. So it's still a read-only contract. In a subscribe to open, we have an assurance model approach to addressing the collective challenge of making content open. So subscribers continue to subscribe, perhaps getting a discount, to ensure that their users have access. And the most prominent examples we have of this are, of course, annual reviews, the Bergen journals in anthropology, but we're increasingly seeing other journals come online trying out this model, particularly in concert with Knowledge Unlatched as often their supportive mechanism. There's two potential outcomes of a subscribe to open offering. The first is that if the subscriber level maintains or increases, then the content is made openly available. It may or may not have a CC license on it, but it is at least open for reading. The other potential outcome is that the subscriber level is not maintained. In other words, if this journal or this reference tool used to have 2,000 subscribers and 200 of them drop, the content will not be made open, but it will still be available to the subscribers. So essentially the mechanism here is a no risk opt-in for those who are already subscribers in order to create the outcome that even those who are not subscribers are able to see the content. But subscribers are thought to sort of still subscribe because they don't want to risk losing access to the content. By the way, you may notice that on the bottom of many of these slides, there's a link to a Scholarly Kitchen article. This is because I've, for better or for worse, I've written pieces on almost all of these models. So needless to say, when there's a whole piece on it, there's a lot more than could be on a single slide. There are also a huge range of what I'll call membership models. In membership models, the content is going to be open. It's an open access publisher. But members receive benefits beyond the content because they are a member. And an example of this is the Open Library of Humanities, where members have some governance and influence on the directions that are taken. But all of the content is always made open. Now, in some of these, obviously the whole point with most of these is that libraries are then supporting or paying on behalf of users, or I should say authors, so that authors themselves do not have to bear the burden of paying to publish. Now, there are lots and lots of iterations and nuance when we go and look at the particular contracts in any of these areas. So we know, for example, that the University of California system is pursuing transformative agreements of the read and publish type, but with a co-payment model or a collaborative model where authors are asked to pay part and the library will pay part. I said that was for transformative agreements, but that's also how their pure publish agreements are structured as well. So there's a lot of detail that we could unpack in all of these models. So I'm happy to talk more about them during the question and answer period. The final thing I want to bring to our attention is that libraries themselves are also becoming publishers. So in addition to supporting publishing that's happening by those organizations that are publishers per se, libraries are themselves beginning to function as publishers. And this is primarily in the US and Canada. We see the Library Publishing Coalition, for example, and all of the libraries that are part of that Library Publishing Coalition, typically those libraries are publishing all of their materials as open access, often without any fees in order to publish. So this has been a whirlwind review of the way that libraries are supporting and paying for open access publishing. I really had to discipline myself in order to make that succinct enough to only take a half an hour, but I'm really looking forward to the extended time that we now have for question and answer. And with that, I believe Eva will be moderating our question and answer.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. This was a very thorough and very nice overview of all the options that library now has to invest in open publishing. I'm afraid we don't have any questions in Q&A section, but I have some questions.
Okay.
So
people may have been waiting to speak.
I hope that.
Yes.
When you talk about, I think that this model of investing in open or subscribing to open and having membership is something that is very promising. But what I wonder from the perspective of a librarian in an underfunded library, and I guess that many of us are in a similar situation, is how to make a case for such an investment. And is this model really scalable to the parts of the world that are not, for instance, high-income countries like Western Europe or Northern America, and really how to advocate for that?
Mm-hmm. So I think I would actually step back one level first, which is how do we advocate for open access investment? And then ask ourselves, where is the best place for us to direct that investment? Not because we wouldn't want to invest in everything, but because we can't. And even sitting here in the United States, in definitely a well-to-do country, at an institution that has, I work at the University of Illinois-Urbana, Champaign. We have a very robust, in the sense of pure dollars, library budget, but we are also being asked to model a significant cut for next year due to the economic impact of the pandemic. And so first we need to say, is this aligned with our values to invest in open access? And I think that the answer has been pretty soundly answered to mean yes, indeed. It's consonant with library values to invest in open access. But what is the best way for us to invest the limited number of dollars that we might have? And I'm not confident that the answer to that will always be a membership model. because those membership models, you know, might not actually give us any additional benefits besides the, oh, look, we're supporting open access, which is a good benefit, except in the cases where we also want to make sure that we attend to disciplinarity differences. And so we might also have a different strategy, like we might pursue the membership model in the humanities, but we might look more to the transformative agreements in other areas, particularly in the sciences, where those have become more available. But those transformative agreements and peer publish agreements are only for those institutions that have high levels of publishing. So I think the other thing that's out there is for what are sometimes called read-only institutions, right? Institutions that don't have a lot of publishing. One of the things that open access allows them to do is to actually redirect monies back to the monograph budget, because so much we have 2 decades now of taking money out of monographs in order to pay for rising subscription costs. And so this is a really complicated issue for libraries, because we can't just only be for open access, we also have to be for access. And so, okay, so having said that, how do we want to advocate for that? I think the person who does this best is somebody in the United States, but is Keith Webster at Carnegie Mellon University. I am very impressed the degree to which he has made the case to his institution that it is in the institution's best interest to support open access, because of the way that it will position their researchers' scholarship into the broader conversation and allow that institution to have a bigger impact than it would have if it publishes in closed journals. Now, I'm sure there's a lot going on behind the scenes, but the big takeaway for me there is that he tied it to institutional goals, not library goals alone. And so I think that's the biggest thing we have to think about, is what does our institution aspire to, and how is open access a mechanism for pursuing what our institutions aspire to. So I see now I've talked long enough for us to generate some questions in the Q&A. So this is great.
Yes, we have 3 questions. Some of them are very broad, so I will read them. First one is from anonymous attendee. He or she says that he struggles with speaking with faculty about how to write into their grants the need for money to publish. Can you speak to that? So this is something related to
this is a great question, because actually if faculties will put into their grants money for OA publishing, that's more money in the system, right? So that's really good. So I think though they are hesitant to do so sometimes because they would rather have the money to do more research rather than to publish the existing research. So again, I think this is where we have to think in our minds, what is motivating to the authors, the faculties who are applying for grants? What is things like impact, right? And so if we can share the studies that show that you have citation advantage if you're publishing open access, although we need to be really honest and make sure we present this accurately, that the data appears to be that publishing in a hybrid journal has more citation advantage than publishing in a pure OA journal. This is generally speaking at this point. I think it's a difficult question, because the other thing, at least I see in the United States, and I'm not familiar enough with other countries to necessarily assume, but think about whether this is happening. The emphasis on green open access, where authors deposit a version of the manuscript, a preprint or an author accepted manuscript, has put open access as something you can achieve without putting it into your grants, because you can do green. So we have a little bit of multiple messages going at faculty. Hey, please put this in your grants to pay for version of record, gold open access. But they've also been hearing a message about green open access and that that's equally good. So we have to acknowledge that they're hearing these two messages. And so we have to then also have a conversation with them about what is the advantages to the version of record being open rather than an author accepted manuscript. Personally, I much prefer version of record open access because it is in the workflow of users. It is more convenient for discoverability, all kinds of reasons. But our authors are receiving a strong message elsewhere that green open access is desirable. So, you know, if we're saying green open access is desirable, we're actually saying please publish subscription. So like it's a mixed message, I guess is the way we would say that. But I think ultimately you have to appeal to the researchers' motivations. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Then we have another set of questions, which is a bit of a discussion in itself about has open access brought more harm than good to libraries? And then we have two other opinions about from Jadranka Stojanovski that no, but because the libraries are also creators and curators of open access content. And also from Radovan Vrana, who asks, what about libraries who do not create or curate open access content? So the role of the library is the question here.
Right. So I don't think open access has brought more harm than good, in part because I think that's it's a very all-encompassing statement, right, of all libraries and the collective impact. So open access to me has brought a lot of good to libraries, even if you do not create open access content. And I will give you an example of why I think this. When I started my career, I worked in what in the United States is called a community college. And I worked in the library there. It's the community college in the same town with the research university that I currently work in. The community college library had one database of articles electronically, and we had a couple hundred journals that we subscribed to. We had hardly any content at all. With 40% of the world's scholarly publishing currently being published open access, that is light years more content that I could now have helped my users get to at that community college than I could have ever hoped or dreamed to have when I was in the subscription model. So collectively, this has definitely meant that people can get access to the scholarly literature, not that even just the general public, but people at institutions that do not have the collections budgets that places like the University of Illinois-Urbana or Harvard or Oxford or, you know, name your top 100 institutions in the world, right? What I will say though is that this has an impact on the portfolio of the library. Because now that those users of these small, these small libraries used to curate a small collection, right? But now they have access to more than 40% of the scholarly output in the world. This has a new role then for the library to not pay for content, not subscribe to it, but we still need to organize it and help people make sense of it. So this is the turn to the services that we need to think about connecting to open access, which is not the open access business models of how do we pay for open access publishing, but it's what do we do in libraries now that our users have a fire hose of scholarly content available to them, not always in a very organized way. You know, we just saw last week 170 some OA scholarly journals that have sort of disappeared from the internet. So how do we find those things and how do we bring them back? I have hope and that libraries are going to see that challenge and say, But then secondly, our users still have the fire hose coming at them too. And so how can we work collaboratively in order to organize and curate that content? Do we have one more?
Yes, I'm sorry, I've lost connection for a minute, so I'm back here now. We have actually one more comment from Jadranka, which is again about the previous issue. Do you think that publishers are putting libraries in the focus because of transformative agreements? At the same time, libraries are losing their importance and role. Is it better to for libraries to focus on open access repositories and own publishing platforms and really create the unique content? So I think that you partly already answered these questions, but maybe just about where is it better for libraries to put their focus on?
Yeah, so I think this again comes down to, there's probably not one answer for all libraries. So libraries have advocated for publishers to offer transformative agreements, right? This isn't something that publishers necessarily have wanted to create, but I think transformative agreements have raised the profile of libraries in certain cases, in certain countries and at certain institutions. But for many libraries, a transformative agreement is not going to be something that they enter. I mean, they never had the big deal for reading content. They definitely don't have enough scholarship output to make striking a transformative agreement a good use of their time, much less a publisher's willingness to do so. So I think what we need to sort of say is, when does it make sense for us to pursue open access payment for publishing to the traditional publishers? And that's probably a certain kind of institution, a research university, a research institute, places where there is that kind of scholarly output. For other institutions, the library may have a more important role to play in sort of fostering a knowledge creation environment within the campus culture through fostering course-based research projects, undergraduate student journals, curation of local content that is special collections. So something we haven't really talked about here because it's outside of that publishing realm is, the rise in the importance of libraries essentially publishing the cultural heritage materials that they steward, those rare books, those unique items that may either be geographically of interest, local community, or they might be the cultural heritage of the world, particularly at those larger libraries, or the British Library, the Library of Congress, the national libraries in all of our countries that hold those treasures. And it's not that they're publishing them as journal articles, they're literally publishing those cultural heritage objects themselves. And I think we see a real call to do so in as open a manner as possible, right? Don't make those a subscription database, but make those something that we as our communities can access and build on, perhaps in order to publish those scholarly articles, but also in order for us to sort of have pride and knowledge of our own history and cultural heritage.
Okay, thank you. So the time for us librarians will be exciting in the next.
Absolutely. Sometimes people say, oh, isn't that a dying profession? And all I can say is, I think absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a few more questions, but maybe we can ask only the last one.
Okay.
Do you have canned content you provide authors information about gold standard OA in hybrid journals to share administrators, so they are not getting mixed messages regarding gold or green as the best for the author in
research?
R50?
Yeah, that's promotion to tenure. Yeah. So no, I do not. Most institutions that I'm aware of are really also pushing green. And so I don't necessarily know that I know any institutions that are necessarily only advocating for gold open access. I think most are doing both. That may even be the right strategy, but it creates kinds of confusion. So, you know, there's so much going on that I think the other thing that maybe we can just say is that libraries can play an immense role of just serving as the explainer. What's happening? Like, how do I even understand this, right? What's this gold and green? I hear about Plan S. Does Plan S matter to me? I don't know, right? Like, we just have a huge role in being a policy interpreter for our campuses, and it's probably not a one-off. It's probably something we have to do repeatedly. Part of which is the reason I started talking about Budapest Open Access Initiative in all my talks is I realized that for a lot of scholars, they think open access happened 3 years ago. They don't realize that there's a 20-year history here. And so they think it happened sort of like it came on their radar with Plan S, essentially. And so they think open access is Plan S. And so we need to give them a much bigger picture here. This is a 20-year effort so it you know, Plan S is just one of the most recent sort of little bombs that got dropped in the middle of it, but it didn't create open access. And so we have that history role to play as well as giving them the global context, which I guess goes back to my title of global and local. So.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. I would love
Wow.
if we could continue talking. You are, as you said, you are active on Twitter, so maybe some of these discussions can continue there. I hope that many of our participants are also following and participating. We will have to stop now for a short break. During the break, there will be some video sponsors from our videos from our sponsors, and then we will continue with the next session at 4:45 in European time. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Lisa. I hope we will have another opportunity to meet in live.
I would enjoy that very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your conference. I believe